Hello and welcome to the EQS webinar, Market Abuse Regulation, Ask the Experts. Thank you for joining. So today we will discuss a number of questions around market abuse regulation. But first I'll just give you a brief introduction to EQS. So we were founded in 2000 in Munich, Germany, originally as a newswire service, and we were then listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange in 2006. And we branched out into a number of other products in investor relations and compliance. On the compliance side, we have regulatory news as an alternative to RNS. We have a policy management system, a gifts and hospitality register, a whistleblowing platform, and pertinent to today's discussion, we have a insider list platform as well from market abuse regulation. So why are we here? On demos that I do, I regularly get asked questions about market abuse regulation, various different aspects. There's also quite a lot of different interpretations from law firms and other experts online. So there just seems to be quite a lot of questions and perhaps grey areas that people are interested to know more about. So we sent out a survey to over 1,200 company secretaries and compliance professionals, asking them a series of just 5 questions about market abuse regulation and how they handle it and various aspects of that. But the final question of that was, if you could ask an expert on MAR any question, what would it be? And actually the questions we got back from that were really interesting. And that was the reason we decided to put the webinar together based on those questions. I'm delighted to say that we're joined today by our experts, Angie Boothroyd and Katharine Leaman. Angie, if you'd like to do just a quick introduction, please.
Yeah, sure. My name's Angie Boothroyd. I am an Associate Director in the Governance, Compliance and Company Secretarial team at One Advisory. So we act as Company Secretary to lots of listed clients, and that includes looking after their MAR compliance.
Thanks, Angie. And over to you, Katharine.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Katharine Leaman. I am a compliance consultant based in London, working for a company, Leaman Crellin Ltd. I've had, about 10 plus years experience at the UK regulator. And subsequent to that, I've worked as a banking compliance officer in a few very large banks as well. So, and spent quite a bit of time on market abuse in those firms.
Thanks, Katharine. Okay, so before we start, we're just going to show you the functions on the webinar platform. The main one for you to look at really is the Q&A box. So please do feel free to put questions in into there for us. We will have a Q&A section at the end for about 15 minutes, but do put them in at any point if it's in reference to what we're discussing at that time or just a general question. And we will endeavour to answer as many as we can at the end. Okay, so we've had our introductions. So the first thing, we're going to have 3 poll questions during the event. And we're going to kick off with the first one now. So for the first question, have you had engagement from the FCA in relation to MAR processes? And if you could just answer that as quickly as possible so that we don't have to wait too long and I don't have to fill this space with my ramblings. And then we can get an idea of what people what people's experiences have been with the regulator. So just seeing how that's coming up. If everyone could just put in their answers quickly. Okay, it's starting to level out. So we had 100% no to start with, but it's starting to level out. Okay, I'll leave it a little bit longer. Okay, let's move on to that. So there we go. So we've had majority no and 10% have said yes. So that takes us nicely on to our first question. So what are the most asked questions by the regulator regarding insider lists? Now, Katharine, I think it makes sense to start with you on this. So perhaps you'd like to kick us off there.
Sure, and I think that's a really interesting poll question result. I was expecting a much higher number of you to say that you had FCA engagement, because they're really focused on issuers at the moment. So if you haven't, you might. So be prepared. If you're asked questions by the regulator, then it depends who's asking the question as to what the most common questions are. So it's generally comes from one of two angles. Supervision. So supervisors at the regulator will be asking questions for the purpose of assessing what are your arrangements. Are you taking all reasonable steps to make sure people who you allow to have inside information understand their obligations, and how have they acknowledged that and their obligations? And you can evidence that through your policies, through your controls, the training that you provide, all around how you identify and then also how you protect information when you have it. For regulated firms, they also start with a question of, can we see your market abuse risk assessment? And the purpose of that is trying to see, okay, well, have you identified all those areas of the business that could give rise to potential market abuse risks? And then how does that risk assessment and how you prioritise things in that risk assessment map to your policies and to your control framework for preventing those risks from arising? Then supervision will ask you a question about, well, how do you test your controls? And a good response to saying to that is to say, well, we supplement our control testing programme, and your control testing programme would be where you're regularly checking, for example, that your folders really are secured, that people with access to those folders align with your insider lists, that the password protection is on. It's those sorts of things. So you'd enhance those regular control tests with maybe getting your audit team involved to run some fake scenarios. And a fake scenario might be, well, actually, we're managing a period of delayed disclosure, and then there's a leak. How do we manage it? It's that sort of thing. So that's a really good way of saying, we're regularly testing our controls, and then actually we're doing something on an ad hoc basis to test those controls. And those are all good responses to give to supervisors. The other angle of regulatory questions are investigatory. So these are questions coming from a team who already know something's off. Remember that our regulators have got a vast amount of data these days. It comes from transaction and trade reporting, it comes from suspicious transaction order reports, it comes from the financial crime suspicious activity report. There's a lot of data our regulators have got, so they can very quickly now spot when something doesn't look right. So if you're getting a question from someone who's coming at it from an investigatory background, then they're going to be asking you, well, who's got access to that information? What information have they got access to? When did they get access to that information? And what do your lists, your insider lists, what do they tell you? Then they move on to questions about specifically that individual. Why? Why did they have access to that information? Excuse me, spluttering. So why did they have access to that information? What did they exactly know? And that's where we've seen feedback from the regulators. Excuse me. Sorry, it's always the way, isn't it? Coughing fit part of the way through. So they'll move into the why that person, what time did you give them access precisely? Exactly what did they know? And that's where we'll see feedback from the regulators saying they want our insider list to be complete and to be very specific, such as the information given by the, excuse me.
Angie, do you want to come in here briefly, maybe if you've got any experience of this side of things from the regulator?
I'd really like to jump in and rescue Katharine right now, but I am one of those lucky 89.5% who've never had any more questions from the regulator. So I consider myself very lucky in that respect. And I've worked with a lot of different companies because I'm from a professional services background. I was in-house, but I'm now in professional services. So I've worked with a lot of companies, and yeah, I've managed to avoid those questions. So.
And none of those companies have had requests either?
No, not during my time with them.
Yeah.
No, so.
Yeah. Okay, maybe go back to Katharine. Are you ready to? Are you able to finish your sentence?
So sorry, minor coughing fit. You can't plan these things, can you? Honestly. So yes, really, they're going to be asking you those questions about why that individual specifically, precisely what time did you give them access to that information? And then they get on to specific questions about, well, does that align with what's in your insider list? Does that align with the activity maybe that the regulator's seen? And as I was, just before I started spluttering, the Central Bank of Ireland last summer issued a Dear CEO letter reminding us that our insider lists do need to be very specific, and they do need to capture that sort of information. And so it's really important that when you're asked by a regulator to provide your insider list, that it is complete, that it does reflect the template that you get from the market abuse regulation, and that every field is populated. And that's really important, and maybe something we can talk about later on.
Great, thanks, Katharine, and well done for getting through. But that's really interesting, I think, to hear from the regulator perspective. You know, that question came up a lot in the survey. In what would you like to ask a regulator? So thank you for that. Let's move on to the second question, which is, what's the easiest way to explain MAR obligations to an operational colleague? Again, this came up quite a lot, and I think, Angie, you've got quite a lot of experience of explaining this, have you not?
Yeah, I do, because I deal with a lot of companies that are newly listed, having just gone through the IPO process. So I find myself dealing quite often with people who have never worked for a PLC. So operational colleagues, you know, all they know is, oh, I've heard something about our company is listing, but they don't know what that means for them in terms of MAR. You also get directors who, it's very easy to just assume that if you're used to working with very sort of older, steadier companies, you just assume that all directors understand all this MAR stuff. But actually, you know, a lot of people find themselves, you know, they've been, you know, CEO of a company for maybe 20 years, but they've never worked in a listed environment. So, so those people really need educating too. And it's not easy. So when you say, what's the easiest way to explain MAR? Well, I haven't found an easy way. But what I find works, and what you kind of have to do, is do lots of training. And it's really important that you get that wider cohort of your restricted list, or so not just the PDMRs, but other people in the organization who are at risk, say, of coming into contact with inside information. Getting those, what I've done is I've done, you know, Teams calls with those people and gone through some slides saying, what does it mean? What is all this PLC stuff? You know, from the very basics, explaining what it means to be a PLC, what the offenses are, what inside information is, and not just once, but you need to update them on probably an annual basis, because people forget. Even directors, executive directors, even forget if they're new to it. You know, you've got to constantly remind them. So it's not easy, but it's because it's a cultural piece, and culture, as we all know, is very difficult to change. You just have to keep on driving that message home. So I think, yeah, face-to-face training. And I think the only way that it really sticks with people is when you bring it to life, or you allow them to ask the questions to bring it to life for them in an actual practical situation. So whenever I do these talks, there's always somebody who says, so if I'm down the pub on a Friday night with my mates, and then I know what's coming. It's like, whoa, let me just stop you right there. If it's not in the public domain, just don't say it. And I think rather than trying to, because it's very difficult to explain to people what the difference is between confidential information and inside information. We all know what it is, and we can provide the training and go into detail about that. But from a day-to-day perspective, I don't expect everyone in the organization to retain that information and be able to make that assessment in their head. I mean, the answer is, if you have inside information, you should have been told that you have inside information and you'll be on the list and blah, blah, blah. But just to make things easy for people, I just say, if it's not in the public domain, don't share it. And then they always say, oh, but, I belong to this networking group of other, say, retailers, and we all get together and talk about sales and this and that, and the problems we're having. It's like, you're going to have to think about those conversations differently. You're going to have to be really careful. Similarly, another question that comes up is, especially in retail, because retail companies typically share all of their sales data across the organization. So all the store managers, for example, will have access to the sales figures for the whole group. And so that is something that has to change, and people are often quite surprised that has to change, but it does. So I guess what I'm saying is, you have to bring it to life in a way that's relevant for each individual. And once you start having an open conversation with them in a group setting, whether it's online or in person or whatever, that's when you start to really chat about it and understand the practical day-to-day implications. So I think that's probably my long-winded way of saying that's kind of the only way to explain.
I like that. If it's not in the public domain, don't share it. I think that's kind of the golden rule, really, isn't it? And Katharine, do you want to come in a little bit here? Obviously, you provide training services. So is there a simple way? Might not be a simple way you can explain it.
So I think the main thing, and actually Angie made the point very well, that it's about bringing it to life and making it real for people. And if the more we can use scenarios, or actually better, getting someone who's, pardon the phrase, been around the block a little bit and seen a few wars, to actually come in and share some war stories, because that's what resonates with people. They remember a story, they remember something, maybe it's shocking, maybe it's really obvious, how could that person have just not realised what they were doing, those sorts of examples. That's really what resonates with people, and that's where the training will stick for them. And that's the key thing, is just making it stick and making it very memorable for people. It's hard for operational people, it's hard for anybody who's not doing this day to day to remember it, because as a company secretary, that's what you do, and you're thinking about it a lot of the time. It's part of the day job, whereas for everybody else, especially operations, it's really not part of their day job. So it's just bringing it to life, as we say.
Okay, thanks, guys. So yeah, I think there isn't necessarily a simple way to explain it. It's probably repetition, training, and the golden rule: if it's not in the public domain, don't share it. Simple as that, really. Okay, let's move on to the next poll question. So how many delayed disclosures have you had in the last 12 months? Fewer than 5, 5 to 10, more than 10. And this will feed nicely onto our next question in relation to delaying public disclosures. So how are we looking there with the answers? If people can just answer that as quickly as possible, we can then bring up the results. At the moment, the majority are saying fewer than 5. Any takers for 5 to 10 or more than 10? Doesn't look like it. Okay, let's bring that up then. Okay, so everyone's saying fewer than 5, which is probably a good thing, I would imagine. So let's move on to the next question. So how long is a reasonable time for delaying publication of an announcement? Katharine, I'd like to go over to you for this one.
Thanks, Adam. I think the most important thing for us to remember when we're thinking about delaying disclosure of something is meeting all of the 3 conditions under the market abuse regulation, which is if immediate disclosure is likely to prejudice the issuer's legitimate interests, whether delay is not likely to mislead the public, and the third one is that we can ensure confidentiality. And interestingly, we've been reminded by both the FCA and the Central Bank of Ireland that we can't just apply the legitimate interest requirement. We have to consider all 3. So I think that's really important. I think it's really important particularly to think about how do you ensure confidentiality? How do you go about doing that? How do you test whether or not delaying disclosure is not going to mislead the public? And there's a few enforcement cases, for example, Christopher Gent, that's a good case, good example, where the regulator clarified that we do need time to draft accurate announcements and get them approved. That's helpful clarification. And then you get something like the Metro Bank fine that we saw in the UK on Monday this week, where you've got individuals who knew there was information that they had that was inaccurate, that they knew that information in the September, and yet by November they were making public announcements that included that inaccurate information with no qualification, no sort of context provided, nothing to say, actually, we knew this was inaccurate by quite a substantial amount. And actually, sorry, I'm going slightly off topic here, but because it's a really interesting case if you read it and it's just out. But what's really interesting as well about that case is they made the public announcement, so they issued the results, they included that inaccurate information in there, and at no point subsequent to that did they follow up with any kind of statement to clarify the position. And when one individual at the organisation, who's currently going through tribunal on this at the moment, when they spoke to an investor who challenged some of the figures and said, these don't look right, they said, oh, I haven't got the maths to hand, knowing full well already that they knew those figures were wrong. So there's a number of things that went very wrong in that Metro Bank case. Really interesting case. As I say, 2 individuals going through tribunal on it at the moment, so more to come out on that. The other piece from that Metro Bank case that's relevant on disclosures that we make is they knew this information was inaccurate, and they didn't go to their board or to their audit committee and ask either the board or the audit committee about the appropriateness of including that inaccurate information, or about how they handle that information. It looks like they did take it through their board and their audit committee. They just didn't have the right conversation there. So there's a lot of takeaways from that. So I diverted because I got very excited by Metro Bank. Back to reasonable time for delaying disclosure. The other piece is it's not 100% clear. It depends on how complex the information is. So if we think we're unlikely to hit our consensus, for example, but we need to go and check again, get further information, carry out mitigating actions, and there's a bit of back and forth there. As I say, the Christopher Gent case acknowledges the need for doing that. But actually, when Adam first posed the question to me before this webinar, I straight away said 24 hours. For me, 24 hours. The moment you've got something that's material, that's not public information, you've got to be constantly asking yourself, why are we not making this public? And constantly, as in every moment, once you've got that information, why are we not making it public now? Why are we not making it public in the next hour? Why are we not making it public in the next hour? And actually, there are many firms who set a clock and they say, after 24 hours, we're going to automatically, not computer automatically, but we will, by default, make that information public. We don't want to be sitting on confidential information like this, where investors are making decisions and we haven't released this information to them. So you've got to think in that sort of mindset, I think. And if you've still got it after 24 hours, why not make it public? And during the time that you've got it, also remember the burden on you for managing that information. You've got to be actively monitoring for leaks, for rumours. You've got to have a draft announcement, holding announcement ready in case there is an actual breach of confidentiality, or you think that that's likely to happen or about to happen. And if that does happen, let's say there is some kind of confidentiality breach, you can expect one of those investigators that I was talking about earlier to be asking you to show them how did you protect that information and what monitoring were you doing throughout the period that you had that information, as well as all those follow-up questions about precisely who knew, what time did they know, precisely what information have you shared with them, why did you share it with that person, why did you share it with that person, it didn't look like they needed it for their job. So they're going to be asking all of those questions and following up with you. So that's why I say the shorter the time, the better. In my view, I think 24 hours is a good target time to try and aim for delaying disclosure. So I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I really like that 24-hour sort of target time or limit, as it were, and to kind of be accountable for that and say, look, we're going to release in 24 hours, if not before, and also just asking yourself why it's not been made public. I think those are probably the core pieces there of why you might want to delay a disclosure. So thank you, Katharine. Let's move on to the next question. Before I do that, I just want to remind people, please do put questions into the question panel in the console so we can answer them at the end for you. Okay, so next question. How do we identify temporary insiders and tips for ensuring executive management tells the company secretary? Angie, I think it'd be a good one for you, this one.
Yeah, so again, this is something that comes down to training and really instilling that culture of vigilance in the organization. And I think you need, so in addition to your share dealing code, you should have alongside of that, or as part of that, you have your inside information management policies. Now, I'm not saying a policy is a cure-all because it has to be implemented, but as a start, you need to have really good inside information management policies that govern how inside information is identified and escalated through the appropriate channels. So in order to identify any temporary insiders, any projects that or any information that may constitute inside information, any projects or whatever, generally I deal a lot usually with the CFO of the company. That's quite often who my main point of contact is, and typically somebody in their team would be aware if something was going on or could potentially be going on. And I always urge the CFO to stay, and the CEO, of course, to stay very close to their teams and to make sure it's kind of on them to make sure that their teams are aware of all this stuff. And obviously I will have given the training to the wider group in most cases anyway. So again, it's a cultural piece. You really do need to make sure that if your contact point is, say, the executive directors, that you are getting them to confirm that their teams really understand this. and that they have processes in place. And again, it's just constantly reminding them. In every board meeting almost that I'm in, I ask the question, are we all happy that nothing here constitutes inside information, that kind of thing. So the escalation process would normally be the person in the CFO's team or the CEO's team would escalate it to the board or to a member of the board, so they'd escalate to the CEO or the CFO, or a lot of companies have a disclosure committee, so it would be escalated to the disclosure committee. It's just about making sure that you have procedures for every step of the way, and that those are really embedded in people's minds. And again, you've got to keep reminding them.
Thanks, Angie. And Katharine, do you want to come in on this one?
So I think there's a great tips from Angie, and it really gets people thinking about who might have access to that information. I really like the role of champions when there's something very critical, and particularly time critical like this. I think there's a lot to be said for having people who champion these sorts of things. And actually, this is where maybe staff in say, the CEO or the CFO's office can come in. They love to get involved. They're usually really hungry to help. And so teaching them about confidential information, protecting confidential information, and reminding their bosses that they need to be talking to the company secretariat when they're spotting and sharing confidential information. It's a really good way of leveraging that skill set and keeping them involved, but hopefully not wall crossing them, so not making them party to that confidential information. It's a good thing that they're there, they're available, they're talking to their bosses all the time, so they're perfect people perhaps to try and help with that, I think. And as I said, I do like a champion. I think, and people like being champions of some things. You want someone who's actually there talking to everybody day to day about some of these topics and sitting amongst them, so they feel like they're talking to, whether it's a peer group or their usual network of people they're talking to day in the office. So it's a good way of just upskilling them and keeping them up to date in terms of what's changing and what's happening.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, I think from what Angie was saying, I think escalation is key, and also training, making sure everyone understands or should understand what is and isn't inside information, and therefore who would be temporary insiders and who not. So thank you for that, guys. So we've got another poll question now. Let's move on to that. So do you have a permanent insider list? Now this comes up a lot on demos that I'm doing. Some companies have very large permanent lists, others don't have them at all. So there's quite a wide range of companies that I speak to. And it does seem to be quite a topic for discussion. Okay, so we've got a fair few there. So it's tipping, the balance is tipping slightly. So we've got 70% to 20, almost 30%. Saying they do. So, Katharine, so what are your thoughts on permanent insider lists? Are they being used correctly?
Wow, what a interesting hot topic question this one is. Most organisations have a number of people who know a significant amount of information about their company. And you need to find some way of allowing them to carry on talking to clients, buying and selling their own shares. But you need tight restrictions around it, particularly, say, for example, the board over their own buying and selling. And it's generally best practice. You'd expect most board members, certainly the CEO, to own company stock because it shows that they're aligned to the company. So you'd expect that. But I think what's happened in the industry is we've been overly cautious and we've cast the net really wide, and so a number of firms have got really broad insider lists. And in my view, that's completely the wrong way of looking at it. In my view, you've got to look at inside information as being precious. It's precious information that belongs to the client, or it's corporate information. So you don't say, well, everybody on this distribution chain can have it. You control it very tightly, and you check every individual and why they personally must have that information. As I say, it's precious, and you want to protect it. What's really topical is yesterday, the FCA issued a market watch on insider lists, Market Watch 71. They issued one about insider lists about 3 years ago, and then that second one yesterday. And about 3 years ago, they sort of said, we're concerned insider lists are too broad. And the one they issued yesterday said, well, actually, since then, a number of firms have reduced the sizes of their permanent insider lists. They've discovered that they're bringing people into the realm of abuse when they don't need to be, or risk of market abuse when they don't need to be. And so they've really controlled and contained the sizes of their permanent insider lists. And you could see reflection back from the FCA that they spent the summer going around talking to a number of mostly regulated firms during the summer, asking them about their market abuse controls, implementation of the market abuse regulation more broadly, but insider lists was a hot topic that came up then. And so a lot of what they've reflected in that Market Watch 71 that came out yesterday is a bit of feedback from some of those visits, which is great. It's really helpful. It's mostly directed at regulated firms as opposed to issuers, but there's a lot in there that you can take away from it. It's well worth a read. It's short. It's only 3 pages, so it's a nice, easy read. It's worth having a look at. Some of the points that they make about use of permanent insiders and use of insider lists are very helpful. For example, they're concerned that contractors haven't been included on insider lists, that not all information has been included on the insider list. In some cases, some organisations rely on other systems to capture personal data. Great way of managing your GDPR obligations, for example. But when the regulator asks you for your insider list, it has to be complete. So it has to include what may be co-sexy on the insider list, as much as that data download capture from, let's say, the HR system of the personal information. In some cases, it looks like what the FCA is telling us is people aren't capturing all the required information on their insider list. So, for example, they're not capturing personal information because, let's say, an individual's declined to provide that under GDPR. As far as the FCA is concerned, in that situation, you need to say, well, if you're not going to give me personal information for the purpose of keeping my log up to date that I'm required to keep up to date, you're not going to get that personal information, that confidential information, and you can't have access to it. So, interesting. The FCA says there's no exemption from GDPR because of MAR. You're required to comply with both regulations. So, another really interesting point that they make. The other interesting point they make, and a helpful reminder, I think, is make sure we capture national identifiers. So national identifiers are listed in the Regulatory Technical Standards, the Market Abuse Regulation. Thankfully, the UK lobbied in favour of ensuring that it was not passport numbers. Gosh, imagine the admin burden of doing that. They change every 5 years. Not everybody's got a passport. So it's national insurance numbers for the UK. So we've got those. That's a far less burdensome requirement, thankfully. And there are a number of other key points that they raise in that Market Watch about insider lists more broadly. But use of permanent insider lists, we are starting to use them more correctly. We are starting to control the access around them. We're starting to ask the right questions about, are we sure it's the whole committee? Do we need to maybe have a smaller committee or smaller number of people from that particular committee in order to discuss that piece of confidential information? Therefore, you're not wall crossing the whole committee, you're just putting a smaller number of people on that insider list. It actually reduces the burden when you do it, because of course the smaller your insider list and your smaller your permanent insider list, then the less admin you have to do, because there's less maintenance, training, etc. of all those people who are insiders. So actually, maybe that's a nice segue, Adam, onto our next question.
Absolutely. Although I did want to raise just one thing before we move on. So in my experience of speaking to company secretaries and discussing insider lists with them, initially, I think it was a good, well-intended process of adding many more than perhaps should have been to a permanent list, because it was a feeling of, right, let's make sure we get everyone, and that's the safer way to do it. And I think obviously over time people have realised that's not the right way to do it, and the FCA has also put out guidance on that. But I think an example that I give on when I'm speaking on demos and so on is that if people are incorrectly classified as permanent insiders, there can be some quite serious ramifications further down the line. So it could be that someone is classified as permanent when they shouldn't have been, and they've left the company. A couple of years later, the FCA get in touch and say, oh, you were a permanent insider at this company, and we noticed that from your personal details, your next door neighbour made a big trade just before results came out on the company's shares. And they say, oh, no, I wasn't a permanent insider. I didn't know about the information. Well, the FCA is not going to say, oh, okay, that's fine, don't worry about it. They're going to say, well, no, you were on a permanent insider list, so, you may be facing sanctions. So I think it's very, very important to make sure that you are categorising people correctly. And I have noticed with companies I speak to, the number is coming down, but I do still speak to companies where they have 20, 30, 50, sometimes even 100 permanent insiders. And I think it's really important that they need to review that and make sure that they are doing it correctly. I mean, just an example, on our Inside List platform, if you do categorise someone as permanent, they will automatically be added to all live projects and any new projects. And when I tell them that, that's often a point where people realise that maybe those people shouldn't be permanent, because they'll immediately say, oh, no, they shouldn't really be on that project. Well, then they're not a permanent insider. So that's just my experience and example that I give. So yes, as you said, Katharine, let's go on to the final question. So how can we make the process less bureaucratic? My initial reaction to that is, should we make it less bureaucratic? But Angie, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, good question. It kind of has to be bureaucratic because that's more. We can't, you can't really cut corners, but you can, again, I think it comes back to thinking about, well, what you were just describing about permanent insiders. So one way of making it less bureaucratic is you get rid of permanent insiders, which I share the view that permanent insiders are just, conceptually, that doesn't make sense to me. And it just feels sloppy. It just feels like an excuse to randomly share, to cover yourself in case you accidentally leak something to somebody. So one way of making it less bureaucratic, of course, little plug for Adam here, is to have some sort of insider manager software so that all of those, so that when you ask PDMRs or insiders to confirm their obligations to you, that can all be done just online through an online platform. So that's one way. And then I suppose also just thinking about not making your restricted list too wide. And we haven't really talked about restricted lists, but of course, most of you are probably aware that restricted lists aren't governed by MAR. It's purely an internal process that companies put into place to protect their employees from inadvertently falling foul of the law. And some companies, I know one company who has made all employees restricted. They're all on the restricted list. So that means every single employee has to, and under their share dealing code, everyone on the restricted list has to seek clearance to deal at any time, no matter what. So to me, that feels like a bit of additional bureaucracy that doesn't necessarily have to be there. So just keeping those lists tight and relevant. But you do need to make sure you have those paper trails. You can't get around that. So automation really is the best thing you can do to cut that red tape out.
Sure, thanks, Angie. And Katharine, did you want to come in on that?
Sorry, scrambling for the mute button. So I think, yeah, those are some very helpful examples. I think you've got to think about that risk-based approach and think about what's the most appropriate way of managing this for our company, given what we know about the nature of our business, how we work. I think that's the most important thing, and to be able to demonstrate that when you're challenged, if that ever happens, if you're one of those, about 5-6% of people on the call today who have been engaged by the regulator, then if they ask you that question, how do you demonstrate what you're doing is risk-based? By using that example, all employees are on the restricted list. Is that really appropriate? Is that the right way of doing it? Why is that risk-based? Why is that relevant for your business? I think that's good questions to be asked. And good challenges to have as well. The other way of making it less bureaucratic, of course, as we talked about earlier, smaller numbers of people on those insider lists, whether they're permanent or event-based, really being very, very tight around that means it's much easier to control and to manage. So I think that's an important point too.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Just the tighter you keep it, the less there is to manage, I suppose. Yeah, there is that element. But like you say, the paper trail needs to be there. I have heard of internal politics coming into play as to whether someone should be on an insider list in terms of their status within the company, which I thought was quite interesting. And I don't know if that happens regularly, but I have heard it on a couple of occasions. Where someone's nose is put out of joint because they're not on an insider list because they felt that they should be in that group. However, that I think is most definitely a kind of a red herring and perhaps a worrying distraction from sticking to what should be done. But thank you both for answering those questions. So we are now going to move on to the Q&A segment. We do have a few questions that have come in. The first one being, and this is interesting, so when an insider leaves the company, should they be kept on an insider list? Angie or Katharine, who I don't mind who.
Yeah, I think, well, this is a really interesting one because Katharine and I have discussed this and we take different views, and I'm very happy to be convinced otherwise. But my view is that when they leave the company, they should cease to be on that list. And I'll tell you why. So if you look at the definition of insider lists, okay, the insider list is a list of all persons who have access to inside information, not people who used to have access, people who have access to inside information and who are working for them under contract of employment or otherwise, blah, 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 advisors, accountants, etc. So to me, this feels like it's a list of people that the purpose of the list is to ring fence that information and to only share it with people who are on that list, right? So that person's left the company. They still have the information in their head. The actual information within the company might evolve and change. They won't know that, so their information will no longer actually be accurate for a start. Secondly, and to me the real key point here is that under the Criminal Justice Act, they're still bound by that. So regardless of being on any list with the company, it's still going to be an offense to deal on the basis of inside information, to encourage anyone else to deal, or to unlawfully disclose that information any further. So So I would say they come off the list, and but are given a friendly reminder that they're still bound by the market abuse laws under the Criminal Justice Act 1993. So that's my view. But I think Katharine has something else to say.
And so, just Katharine, just before you come in, on that point, Angie, would you then change their email address that's in the system?
I wouldn't, because I would just say they ceased to be on the list because they've left the business, and leave it at that.
Okay.
Katharine?
So I concur with a lot of what Angie said. For me, the key question is, do they still have confidential information, inside information? If the answer to that question is yes, then in my mind, then they need to stay on that insider list, even though they're no longer an employee. And you therefore need to capture all the personal information and update all of that information for the purpose of your insider list because of that reason. I think the point Angie makes about reminding them of their obligations at the point that their employment contract's terminating, really important, very, very important that people who've been on that insider list and have had, past tense, had inside information, they need to be reminded about their obligations. But for me, the fact that the individual's leaving doesn't of itself mean that they cease having that inside information. The point that they leave the organisation, they still potentially have that inside information, and they could still potentially act on that inside information. Therefore, they're still an insider. Therefore, and your organisation is the one who created, generated, originated that inside information. Therefore, it's really important that you still carry on treating them as an insider, and that you keep their information up to date on the inside list. So I'd say keep them on there. And actually, I would err on the side of caution on that until you know that that confidential information has changed materially, such that it's now stale for the individual. I wouldn't close them off and say that they've ceased having access to it until you know it's materially changed.
Yeah, I have to say, I think I'm in agreement with Katharine on that one. In my mind, until that information changes, they are still an active insider on the list, I would say. If they've left the company, then obviously their details should be updated in terms of their email address, and maybe change it just to their personal email address. But yeah, in my view, until that information has changed, and therefore they no longer have accurate information, they should stay on the list. And the same with permanent insiders. I mean, it's exactly the same rule, really. The moment they leave the business, they're no longer a permanent insider anyway. But then they should be kept on all projects that they had access to until that changes. But I can understand Angie's point as well. It is a bit of a grey area, perhaps. But great to get both of your points of view on it. I'm just conscious of time, so I want to make sure we answer as many questions as we can. So we're going to move on to a question we have here. So, should all employees be given a full copy of the share dealing code, including the policy for PDMRs and insiders, or should they only receive the section of the policy relevant to them in order to avoid confusion?
I can answer this quickly.
Yeah.
So all employees, typically the way we would advise this is done is all employees get just a one-pager that's just sort of says we have a share dealing code, and, you'll know if you're put on it, if you are subject to the code. In other words, if you're a restricted person or you're an insider or whatever. So it's just to alert them to the fact that this exists as a thing. And then you have your share dealing code, which is only sent to people who are subject to the code. So that might be PDMRs, or people who have come onto an insider list, or it might be people on the restricted list. Great,
thank you, Angie. And another question, what do companies enter if, for example, the insider does not have all the telephone numbers that are required, e.g. work telephone number, as this shows data missing on our insider list? Katharine, maybe that's for you.
Yeah, that's tricky. So let's say it's the work telephone number and they don't have a work telephone number, it's only their mobile number or something, and you've already captured that, then you just need to say that on the insider list, that there isn't one. It doesn't, it's a point of fact, it doesn't exist. If it does exist and they haven't given it to you, then you have to get it from them, because you have to populate all of those fields on the insider list. So if it's something, as I say, if it's something that just doesn't exist, that's a statement of fact. Replicate that statement of fact on the insider list.
Great, thanks. And this might have to be our final question. When you talk about employees being on a restricted list, are you talking about employees of a service provider, i.e. all employees of the firm providing COSEC services, for example?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So a restricted list is a list of people within the organization, so employees who management have determined are sort of likely to come into contact potentially with inside information. Therefore, they are placed on a list, which is typically called a restricted list, and it's just an internal list for the company so that they can impose rules around dealing. So they might say that everyone on the list needs to seek permission prior to dealing, or they might be under the same restrictions as those people who are as PDMRs and whatnot. So that's what's meant by that. But it just to be clear, that's not governed by MAR, but it is standard practice for most companies.
Okay, and I think let's squeeze in one final question. We've got 1 minute. Very quickly. So at what point, if at all, does information about a potential acquisition become inside information?
So I would say from the point that you start talking about a potential acquisition, you need to be looking at it continuously, as this has potential to become inside information. And so from the moment you start talking about it, you want to start treating it in that way, even if you don't formally classify it as inside information until further down the line, until it's gone from the initial exploratory conversation into something that's much more realistic and likely to happen. So it depends on every deal, on every arrangement. There isn't, unfortunately, I can't give you a categoric, unlike my 24 hours, I can't give you a categoric answer on that. It really depends on the specific deal. But start from the point of, it's going to become inside information at some point, and I think you'll be going in the right direction. Can I just add a point on restricted lists, which is, in regulated firms, they have a thing called a restricted list, which is something that they have to have. You record in that restricted list all the particular stocks, shares, whatever it is, that are restricted because the organisation is in possession of a certain amount of information about that company. So it's not individual specific, it's actually relevant to clients or corporates that the company's facing. And we call that a restricted list in that sense. I thought it was just worth mentioning that because some people might have heard it used in different terms and context.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katharine. Okay, well, thank you both for your points on the discussion. It's been really interesting. So just as we wrap up, please do go to our website. We have plenty of supporting information, blogs, other webinars upcoming. So do take a look. And I would also ask you that we have a very, very short survey at the end of this. If you would just stay on once the webinar has finished, just to give your feedback as attendees, and we'd really appreciate that. But thank you for joining, and we hope to see you soon on a future webinar. Thanks very much.